Welcome to the Black Women and Political Leadership class of 2023, a lecture titled Harriet Tubman, National Memory and the Making of a Black Feminist Icon. We thank Professor Janell Hobson of Albany, nearby Albany, for joining us. Seems far away, but really close technically. But I want to say that we were really pleased to have her visit because of her work on Harriet Tubman for the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial. So she's positioned as one of the scholars who can really take us where we want to go today. This is also an African Diaspora Knowledge Exchange project developed with eCornell to help cover knowledge gaps often that occur in terms of African diaspora knowledges worldwide. Past speakers for the Black Women in Political Leadership class and other related classes have been Barbara Smith, the famous Black feminist icon of Combined River Collective Statement, Diane Abbott, the MP from London, Hackney, Angela Figueiredo from Brazil, and soon Francio Guadalupe, who will talk about the Dutch Caribbean and questions of music and musicality. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors and supporters, Shelby Dana Champlain of Africana Studies for her work, tireless work to really execute some of these amazing events. American Studies program with its director, Shirley Samuels, the Society for the Humanities, Cornell, Feminist, Gender and Sexuality Studies and Literatures in English, my other department. The amazing team at eCornell, always, we want to thank you. In the process of empowering students, however, our speaker will be introduced by one of this year's cohorts class in the Black Women and Political Leadership class. Her name is Naomi Erin Boateng. She's Ghanaian descent, but Chicago native. That's truly African diasporic positionality. Naomi Erin, I ask you to introduce our speaker.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm really pleased to be introducing Janell today. Janell Hobson is Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Albany, State University of New York. She's the author of 3 books, When God Lost Her Tongue, Historical Consciousness and the Black Feminist Imagination, Venus in the Dark, Blackness and Beauty in Popular Culture, and Body as Evidence, Mediating Race, Globalizing Gender. She has also edited several volumes, including the Routledge Companion to Black Women's Cultural Histories. Hobson is a regular contributing writer to Miss Magazine and guest edited the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project through the magazine's online platform and special print section in 2022, a project supported by Hobson's time as a 2021 to 2022 Community Fellow at the University of Albany's Institute for History and Public Engagement. Her areas of research include Black women's representations and history. She's planning a full-length biography on Harriet Tubman and is co-editor along with Carol Boyce Davies, Mishai Mwangola, Angelique B. Nixon, and Kristen Smith of the forthcoming The Black Feminist Theories Handbook. Thank you, Professor Hobson. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Naomi. Thank you also to Carol Boyce Davies, who invited me to participate in her class on Black women's political leadership. Thank you for Africana Studies at Cornell University for featuring this particular subject matter. It's dear to my heart, and I'm always interested in thinking about how women's gender and sexuality studies intersects with Africana studies always, since that is the focus that I do in terms of Black women's histories and representations. So I am going to be talking with you all today, this evening, on Harriet Tubman, National Memory and the Making of a Black Feminist Icon. I think it is such a timely topic when we think of the different kinds of conversations we're having in the public discourse about the importance of Africana studies, the importance of gender studies, and also just the importance of history and Black history in particular. So I would like to, in this presentation, talk with you about how Harriet Tubman is being configured and reconfigured in our particular contemporary moment, because she does surface in our national memory in some very interesting ways. And I want to think about how those ways also make room for what I call the making of a Black feminist icon. So I have a number of slides that I've prepared to help us have this conversation. So we can start with my first slide. And so here I'm going to talk a little bit about the images that I chose for this title slide. So as you can see, there are two images that I highlighted here. One is actually a detail from a work that was created by a digital artist. Her name is Natrice Gaskins, and she created an important cover art for the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project. She was commissioned to do some original work for us, and she works with AI technologies. And so she created this particular portrait of Harriet Tubman through an AI program called Dream Generator. Or actually deep dreaming, I think is what it's called, deep dreaming. And so I think it's so interesting that she incorporated both a well-known image, a portrait of Harriet Tubman, but she also integrated a star pattern to highlight her particular relationship with the North Star that led her to freedom. So she eventually called the work Beacon of Hope. So she created that in 2021, and then we were able to highlight it as the main image for the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project. The other image on my right is a little less related to Harriet Tubman, but not really. So this is actually one of the first images that came to us from the James Webb Space Telescope that was launched on Christmas Day 2021. And we started receiving images from this telescope around the summer of 2022. I'm including it here, not just because of the relationship Harriet Tubman has to stars, but because the James Webb Telescope precisely was being considered to be renamed the Harriet Tubman Space Telescope. But in the end, NASA chose to stick with their bureaucratic hero, who is James Webb, even though various people in the community of astronomers had issues with his particular history. They wanted to rename it after someone who was worthy. And so one of the lead scientists in an article for Scientific American, Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, she's a Black feminist astronomer, and she actually put forth the proposal to rename it Harriet Tubman because of the importance of her own journey using astronomy to actually get to freedom, as well as being able to rely on that same journey, going back 13 times to the slave South to free her family and friends and anyone else who needed to escape out of slavery. So I wanted to put those there because I really thought about what are the implications of thinking of how we try to invoke Harriet Tubman in these very contemporary moments. So in my next slide, I am going to now talk a little bit about my introduction to the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project. So I put forth an introductory essay, which was an opening to a number of essays, a series of essays that I had edited together with some guest contributors to talk about different aspects of Harriet Tubman's life and legacy. So, for example, I mentioned Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, the astronomer, who contributed an essay called Harriet Tubman, Astronomer Extraordinaire. And she talks about thinking about Harriet Tubman's relationship to astronomy, for example. And then there were other scholars like the ethnomusicologist Maya Cunningham, for example, who gave us a whole playlist and a history of Harriet Tubman's life through her own relationship to music. And music was integral to many of her escape routes. So there were so many different ways that we were able to explore Harriet Tubman and her legacy. So I'm just going to read aloud. This is actually a snapshot of the first opening segment of my introductory essay. 200 years ago, a child was born into chattel slavery. She grew up to become a liberator, abolitionist, diviner, healer, nurse, naturalist, freedom fighter, military raid leader, spy, scout, suffragist, daughter, sister, wife, mother, aunt, friend, national icon. This is the legacy of Harriet Tubman, born Araminta Ross, called Minty in her youth, and heralded as Moses in her extraordinary adult years of emancipatory action. Harriet Tubman's bicentennial birthday comes at a time when our nation and the world exist at a crossroads. Indeed, Isabel Wilkerson, the award-winning author of Caste and the Warmth of Other Suns, reminded us on social media that 2022 is a turning point in terms of the equally matched number of years in the United States, 246 to be exact, between the practice of slavery, 1619 to 1865, and the practice of democracy as an independent nation, 1776 to 2022. Facing the uncertainties of climate crises and pandemics, wrestling over racial and political divides, reckoning with the Me Too response to sexual violence, and rethinking inclusive education, we were poised to move in different directions, to teeter backwards into the stranglehold of what the late bell hooks warned as, quote, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, unquote, or to propel forward towards an anti-racist feminist future built on a firmer foundation of justice for all. So in this introduction, I wanted to position Harriet Tubman as someone who was literally at our crossroads in terms of, are we moving forward or are we moving backwards? And I really thought that her bicentennial birthday last year was a moment for us to pause and to think about where we were and where we need to be going. And, the image that I have here of Harriet Tubman kind of like suspended in space, represents that on the one hand, she belongs to history, but she also belongs to our moment. She belongs to a kind of timelessness. She belongs to our futuristic, our hopeful future, really. I am going to add another line from that introduction. Tubman, who was once described by biographer Milton C. Surnett as a litmus test for diversity and inclusion, is an apt symbol, an apt historical symbol for our current age. So I'd like us to think about how Harriet Tubman can be an actual historical symbol for what it is that we're dealing with in this particular moment. So in my next slide, I'm just going to give you some important dates from Harriet Tubman's life, because as much as she's well known, I think in our culture, I think most people are not aware of all that she's done. She lived to be 91 years old. And yet most of what we know about her is reduced to like just one decade in her life. I mean, that particular decade is important because it's all about the leadership that she was doing when she was leading people out of slavery. And that is nothing to minimize by any stretch of the imagination, but she also continued that work. So thinking about her entire life is an opportunity to think about all the ways that she was a leader beyond just the Underground Railroad. Some of the images that I've included here as well, I think are useful for us to think of in terms of how we envision Harriet Tubman. So the image at the top from 1886, I think is a well-known photograph of her. She's around 64 years old when this photograph was taken. And it's also the image, I believe, that is being used to redesign the new $20 bill. The sketch that we see here circa 1868 is from her first biography by Sarah H. Bradford called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. It's based on the work she was doing during the Civil War. When she was a scout and a spy and a nurse and a cook, doing all of those duties during her work with the Union Army. And then the very bottom image, circa 1911, 89 years old, just 2 years before she dies. This is when she had also become ill enough to actually be entered into the home that she helped establish for the sick and the elderly. And so that is also part of her own leadership as well. So 1822, she was born Araminta Ross, nicknamed Minty. We know she was born in 1822 because of a primary source document that showed a payment to the midwife who helped her mother, Harriet Green, deliver her baby, and she was one of the only enslaved infants born during that time. So this is how historians have been able to pinpoint an actual date when she may have come into this world. The next dates that I highlight here, 1834, 1835, that's like a guesstimate really of when she was an adolescent and she was severely injured. She was on a errand to a neighborhood store where an overseer was trying to strike an enslaved fugitive who was on the run. And unfortunately, Harriet Tubman, she got in the way. I should say Minty, because she was Minty at the time, got in the way. And she was struck by this 2-pound lead weight, and she nearly died. Struck in the head, nearly died. And from that injury, she suffered what many believe to be temporal lobe epilepsy. And from these seizures, she would have hallucinations. She would be in a dreamlike state. She would have these outer body experiences. And I mentioned those because despite her disability, she actually found strength in her disability because the dreams and the hallucinations made her feel closer to God. And so she developed a deep spirituality out of that experience. Also, her mother, helped nurse her back to health when she was left for dead by, these neglectful enslavers. So obviously, family would be an important part of Harriet Tubman's life. Since a child, she would be separated from her parents and her siblings, and she would sneak out at night, trying to go to her mother's house where her mother was staying. She and her siblings also were able to meet up with her father, who eventually was able to achieve freedom and eventually was able to purchase the freedom of her mother, which is interesting because he was not able to free all of his children. Actually, that would be what Harriet Tubman will do later on, because when she escapes, she's able to go back and free many of her siblings. So she marries in 1844 a free man named John Tubman, and she renames herself after marriage, Harriet. And Harriet is the name of her mother. So I think in a lot of the stories about Harriet Tubman, there's this idea that, Harriet Tubman is the name she named herself in freedom. It's like, no, that's not exactly what happened. Now, granted, her brothers, when they reached freedom, they did rename themselves, but Harriet actually named herself in her marriage. So she was obviously thinking of a different kind of role for herself when she entered into that marriage. Now, that marriage didn't last long because, in 1849, she made the drastic decision to run away when her owner had passed away suddenly. And because of that, she was afraid, and rightly so, that the widow of her owner was prepared to sell her and others further south into slavery. That's what people did when, they found themselves in debt. And so she wanted to make a clean break. Many have made some arguments about why didn't John Tubman go with her? Because he didn't. Actually, he wanted to discourage her from running away. Many believe that that is less about him being unsupportive and more about really fearing that the well-laid plans they had for themselves, where Harriet was actually trying to buy herself out of slavery because she was garnering wages for herself, and she made a deal with her owner before he died, to try to keep some of her own earnings so that she could eventually buy herself out of slavery. So there's enough there to believe that John Tubman was just concerned that by running away, she was just going to make things worse. But she, had that vision, she had that belief. And the first time she actually ran away with 2 of her brothers, but then they suddenly did not feel confident in the direction that they were taking. So they went back. So on her own, she actually took off and did that 100-mile trek to freedom to Philadelphia. And so I love that story just because it's like, okay, husband's keeping me back, brother's keeping me back, I'm going. So, and really having that faith, knowing something about this Underground Railroad, because people, she's living in a society of both enslaved and free Black people. She's lumbering, alongside her father and her brother. She's meeting with various merchants and shipmen who are working on the docks in Maryland, and from there she's learning about the paths that you can actually take to freedom to the north. So she relied on that faith, she relied on that knowledge, and by night she was following the North Star, daytime she was hiding out and finding out which abolitionist allies were going to be able to hide her out until she reached freedom in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia is where she meets up with William Still, who's the station master of the Underground Railroad, and helps her, find a place to live, working as a domestic, and eventually deciding, I can't be free if all my family's, is back in slavery. So she makes that choice to go back. And so that's what she sets out to do. So during the decade of the 1850s, she's going back time and time again to free others. She tried to free her husband, but she went back like 2 years after escaping in 1849 and goes back and finds out that he's actually moved on to someone else. So heart was broken, but she continued her work, and she rescued most of her brothers. There was that one time in 1854, she goes back on Christmas Day and is able to get 3 of her brothers out of slavery. And, there were so many others. There are so many different stories on her journey on the Underground Railroad, as well as her reliance on other allies. So Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York, with his wife, Anna Murray, were also allies who helped her. There were allies in Philadelphia, allies in Boston, allies in Albany. So, and all around upstate New York, you'll probably find different areas and locations where they were doing that important work. 1858, 1859, I wanted to mention because I think this is an interesting moment when she meets John Brown. He's this white radical abolitionist who is all about militant resistance to slavery. And it's interesting, she meets him in Canada and is so convinced about the mission to actually take up military arms, to fight our way out of slavery. So she helps to recruit formerly enslaved in Canada to join in his raid on Harper's Ferry. And around the same time, she also purchases a home in Auburn, New York, which is not far from the border, the Niagara Falls border. She did that because her parents, that she was also able to free, not just her siblings, she freed her parents and got them to Canada, but they found Canada to be much too cold. So she actually was looking for another place to live, and she found this acreage of land and a house that she was able to buy from William Seward, who would go on to become the Secretary of State in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. So some very interesting connections that she's had along the way, which is why I think we know her, because she was so well connected and everybody was so impressed with her that everybody wanted to write about her, which is why we know of her today. 1860 is the year, that was the year of her final rescue mission in Eastern Shore, Maryland. Unfortunately, that was the year she was trying to go back for a sister of hers named Rachel. But unfortunately, her sister died, and so she was not able to get her out of slavery. But she did try to go back to rescue her sister's children, but lost track of them, and instead actually found another family to save. So that was it. By the time she got back, and that happened at late December 1860. That was her final mission on the Railroad. But her work was not done. As you can see, 1862, 1865 is when she's doing that work with the Union Army as a scout, spy, nurse, and cook. And actually, she was recommended because of how skilled she was leading people on the Underground Railroad. One of her biggest missions was helping to lead soldiers in a military raid on the Combahee River of South Carolina in 1863, and that liberated close to 750 bondspeople. So, she was doing that work. Most people are still like, wow, that's amazing. And it is amazing when you think that she kept doing that work. And I think for Harriet Tubman, oftentimes people just didn't see her coming. She's the small, diminutive little woman. She's like 5 feet, and very unassuming. So people didn't see, she could actually, become invisible in so many ways. I think that's really what helped her to do the work that she did. But after slavery, is abolished, after the war is over, she also was trying to get paid, and because the Union Army was not interested in paying women. Surprise, surprise, she was denied veterans pay. And so we were able to get the first biography by Sarah H. Bradford called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman, which was actually written to raise funds because Tubman was denied her veterans pay. So in so many ways, it's like we know of her because they had to put this effort out just to show how worthy she was and what a soldier she was, right? A year later, she marries Nelson Davis, who is a veteran. He fought during the Civil War, but he was also a boarder in her home. This is something else that she takes up after the war and after slavery. After buying her house in Auburn, she has her parents and siblings living there, but she also has all kinds of people coming and going. She's got her house open. She welcomes orphans. She welcomes elderly. She welcomes even battered women who are escaping abusive homes. She was doing that work and turning her home into like this radical refuge. And so that's another way that we can think of her leadership. Also in 1886 is when we get a new biography by Sarah Bradford called Harriet Tubman, the Moses of Her People. And that is because her house did burn down. And so again, they were looking for an opportunity to raise money, to rebuild, and we get a second biography out of fundraising. But 2 years later, she is widowed again in 1888, which is interesting because her second husband was like 22 years younger than she was. But he seemed to have had, a certain kind of weakened lung condition because he died of tuberculosis. 1896, she attends the founding convention of the National Association of Colored Women in DC. She's also active in the women's suffrage movement. And I think this is an interesting time because now we see her becoming more public. So we kind of see this path where first it was Underground Railroad, then it was Civil War, and then it's like I'm building my home and bringing everybody into my home. And now that she's widowed and she's already in her 70s, and by 1896 she's actually coming out into the public. And so she's secure in her legacy, but she's continuing that work. And I think that's an interesting pivot that she's doing there. And because of that, she also has a new vision, which is to raise money to build a home for the aged and the sick. This is especially for African Americans who were being denied care in many of the established homes for the aged. So she also had that vision in mind in terms of taking care of my people, right? And so again, a second edition of the biography, Harriet Tubman, The Moses of Her People, is published to, again, raise funds for this project. There will be a third and final edition of that biography in 1901. I think it's interesting that with this particular edition of her biography, I believe that is the version that reached Queen Victoria, because Queen Victoria later sent Harriet Tubman a silver medal commemorating her Diamond Jubilee, as well as a lace shawl and all that kind of stuff. And of course, Harriet Tubman is proud, that she received a lace shawl from the Queen. But I think it speaks to, how she's becoming like this celebrated figure. This is also around the time too that because of this third edition, her various allies are able to now create a campaign to really push for her to get her veterans pension, because she does finally get her pension like 1899, and she's very old. And the veterans pension ended up being something like $20 a month. So the irony of wanting to put her on a $20 bill when that's what she was earning at the end of her life. Finally, 1908, her Harriet Tubman home opens, and she actually includes an infirmary that she names John Brown Infirmary, which again, I think attests to the kind of close relationship that she had. And then 1913 is when she dies on March 10th. So very fascinating life. Different stages of her life to do the kind of work, even though, again, we all know the 1850s, that era of working on the Underground Railroad. So yes, that period is important, but I think we should also keep in mind, what does it mean to reduce an entire life of 91 years just to a decade, when there are so many other elements of her life that really gives us a more holistic picture of who Harriet Tubman was. So now I'm going to talk about some other timeline events, so what I call symbolic events, because this is germane to our particular time period. So one, I want to start with 2015, because this is the year that Harriet Tubman wins the Women on the 20 national contest to replace President Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill to commemorate the 2020 centennial of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, which is interesting. The co-founders of the Women on the 20, they were interested in doing a special commemoration of the 19th Amendment, and they wanted to do something beyond just like, erecting a statue, right? They thought something tangible like money was a good way to try to honor women's history. And they were thinking of that in particular because it was so obvious that all these symbols on our currency happen to be men. So they chose currency as a potential commemoration. And not only that, they thought, well, of all the people on our money, well, let's get rid of Andrew Jackson. He's problematic. He started the Indian Removal Act. He's a slaveholder, all the things that, we don't really need to celebrate. And so they mounted this campaign, and they were able to get hundreds, if not thousands, who actually participated in voting on what woman they thought should be on our 20. And lo and behold, the majority chose Harriet Tubman, which I think is fascinating. She beat out Rosa Parks. She beat out Eleanor Roosevelt. She beat out Susan B. Anthony. Folks were like, we want Harriet Tubman. So that was just a grassroots campaign. But in 2016, the Treasury Department under President Obama actually commits to placing Tubman on the $20, with President Andrew Jackson relegated to the back by 2020. Now, some folks are like, just get rid of Andrew Jackson, period. Right. But I think this was mitigating a whole lot of political issues, obviously. And just as an aside, at the time, the Treasury was thinking, because there was the $10 bill that was up for redesign, they were going to actually demote the campaign to, well, we don't need to change it 20 because it's not time to change it 20, but we can change it 10. So why not? Why not put the woman on the $10? So they were so not feeling that at all, not to mention something happened in the culture, something called Hamilton on Broadway, that basically saved Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill. So that didn't get touched. And so they did push forward to have Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And this design that you see here is actually the official redesign that came out in 2016. Now, granted, it's going to be a while before we see it, but it will be interesting to think about whether or not they stick to this design. But then, of course, I'm talking about timeline of symbolic events, because the year after, when a certain person got into power, Most people probably forgot about this, but one of the very first things he did before he decided to separate families at the border, before he did the Muslim travel ban, first thing he does is he hangs a portrait of Andrew Jackson in his Oval Office. So he didn't say, I'm putting the kibosh on the Tubman 20, but he didn't have to because symbolic gestures matter. And not only do symbolic gestures matter, but always, as Gerda Lerner, the feminist historian, always reminds us, to those in power, history has always mattered. So this really meant something to make this particular gesture of, I don't care what anybody says, I'm keeping Andrew Jackson, I'm hanging his portrait on the wall, which basically was, he didn't say it, but he definitely was gesturing that we're not making any changes. But symbolic gestures matter, right? Because just a few months after he does all this, something wonderful happens, and that's a new carte de visite of Harriet Tubman is discovered. And this is the portrait of Harriet Tubman, discovered in a photo album. And of course, I said to one of the Tubman biographers, Kate Larson, I'm like, okay, I think this was Harriet Tubman's way. It's like, yeah, you're not going to forget me. You already put my name out there. You are not forgetting me. She just came out here. Not only did she come out with a new photo, but she also came up with one that's a kind of where she's elegantly dressed, because there were also some really ignorant people saying, well, is she pretty enough to be in our money anyway? Talk about Harriet Tubman. It's like, oh, you want me pretty? Here you go. So I absolutely love the way this just came up. It just came out of nowhere, and yeah, I think our spirits talk to us in so many different ways. So yeah, Trump is saying what he's doing, and Harriet Tubman is like, whatever, you're not going to forget me. And what's interesting is with the discovery of this new portrait, this has now actually become the go-to image that many artists and others have been using. So there's something about that photograph that really speaks to our moment, right? And not only that, I think with that particular rediscovery of one of her new portraits, we also had all these other developments taking place. So 2019, 2020 is another important moment. This is, think of the New York Times when they issued the 1619 Project that was commemorating the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship arriving in one of the English colonies in North America. This is edited by Nicole Hannah-Jones. And if we remember, this really ignited very intense political debates over the origins of US history and slavery. And then the following year, 2020, we have the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter that ignites this whole moment of racial reckoning. And then the eventual vilification of critical race theory by conservatives. Prior to Trump losing his reelection, he did issue an executive order banning critical race theory that he just learned about actually watching Fox News, where some conservatives decided to use the term as a way to weaponize it. So this is the kind of backlash that we saw happening. But as I said, losing a reelection means new administration. And in 2021, President Biden removes Andrew Jackson's portrait from his Oval Office and includes like Rosa Parks' bust, and I think the bust of Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln. In other words, now we're shifting again, right? So who knows who's going to be elected in 2024, 2028, whether or not, depending on who's in the Oval Office, if we'll see Tubman 20. But the Tubman 20 is back on the agenda, even though because of all the new changes that are being made to the redesign, it's going to take longer. So 2030 is actually the year that the Tubman 20 is expected to appear. So that's 7 years from now. We will see what happens after all that. So interesting moment, right? Because this is the afterlife of Tubman. There's the life she lived, and then this is the way that she is actually shaping our very contemporary moment. And also, even though we can talk about there's like this political shift in terms of those who supported Tubman 20 and those who don't, there were progressives and Black feminists who were against the idea of Tubman being on our $20 bill. These are two think pieces that came out both in 2021, basically putting Harriet on the 20 bill is not a sign of progress, it's a sign of disrespect. And do not put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. And so that is not, this is a very different kind of, you know, political ideology that's being articulated here, which has nothing to do with someone like the former president, you know, insisting that, you know, our money needs to be all white men, right? Very different kind of critique that is being offered here. And even then, I do know, for example, when I interviewed some of the Tubman descendants, and Ernestine Wyatt in particular, she descended from one of Harriet Tubman's sisters. This is what she says about that whole debate. There are some people that feel because we were once a commodity and there was an exchange of money, that it is an insult for her to be on the money. But I want people to look at it in a different way. All the people that are on the money, first of all, they are white, they are men, and they did something that helped move the country forward. The union that we have today, Aunt Harriet helped to preserve it. So a very different position, obviously. Those who see Harriet Tubman on the money as asserting her right in our national history, versus those who see in it some kind of reinforcement of some kind of commodification and objectification of her image. I tend to like the idea of her on the 20, just because once you are in our history in a visible way, it's hard for people to forget you. So I think in terms of remembrance more than anything. And also others are championing this idea. So one of my favorite images was a music video from the rapper Rhapsody. It's a video that came out in 2019 called Oprah, which is all about Black women's economic empowerment. And so she's just flexing, you know, manifesting into being the Tubman 20, and she's holding all these dollar bills with Tubman's image on it, which I think is part of what I'm calling a tradition of what I think of as Harriet Tubman's hip hop daughters, who have always been signifying in Harriet Tubman in some interesting ways in the music. So 30 years before Rhapsody, Queen Latifah, you know, opened up her music video Ladies First, featuring Moni Love, with a slideshow of Harriet Tubman as kind of like, she's our symbolic leader. And so I think there are ways in which she has become just this Black feminist icon within popular culture and within Black feminist movements in general. And incidentally, earlier this month, Queen Latifah was at the unveiling of a Harriet Tubman monument called Shadow of a Face in Newark, New Jersey. As a Newark native, she was invited to be part of it, as well as she voiced a whole narration speaking from Tubman's perspective for this monument. So there's a way in which Newark is connecting these two icons in some important ways. And I think of Harriet Tubman here as being a kind of national signifier of progress. So the image on the right is the actual monument that is now in Newark, New Jersey. It is designed by a Black woman artist named Nina Cook John, which is based on, she calls an outline of Harriet Tubman that she creates like a sundial with that outline at the centerpiece of it. And it's a mosaic of different communal narratives as well as Harriet Tubman's narrative. And she uses the space right in the wall, the face of Harriet Tubman. And she based it on some Congo cosmograms in terms of the sundial, and also at nighttime, it lights up because she also wanted to invoke the idea of Harriet Tubman as a North Star. So all of that, you know, comes together in this really impressive monument, which not only does it replace a statue of Christopher Columbus that was removed, it also is now a centerpiece of Washington, the park that was once called Washington Park. It was renamed Harriet Tubman Square, Juneteenth of 2022. So I think what we're seeing here, the removal of Christopher Columbus, the renaming of Washington Park to Harriet Tubman Square, we're seeing these very interesting contemporary gestures to assert Harriet Tubman in a kind of propelling us forward. Whereas these other founding fathers, so to speak, represent some kind of past. I think there's some interesting work that's going on here, trying to move us forward in a progressive way through the symbol of Harriet Tubman. But then it's not just Black feminists signifying that's happening, because guess who else is claiming Harriet Tubman? So this is a statue that was erected at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. She is being recognized for her work as a spy during the Civil War. So, and yes, there is the U.S. Army who the year before also inducted her into their Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. And that is also deliberate, because they are now on a mission to diversify their ranks, both in the CIA and the Army. They're trying to recruit more underrepresented people, marginalized communities. They've always reached out to Black communities, so that's not surprising. But it is interesting that we have this kind of conservative turn where Harriet Tubman is not Black feminist signifier. She's actually, a symbol of patriotism. And so this is the statue that is, like I said, erected. It's designed by a white male sculptor named Brian Hanlon. And I think here you can see it's a lot more traditional in terms of it's a bronze sculpture. It also represents, a kind of classical construction. She's more feminine here. So I just think that it's useful for us to think about, okay, so what is that? What is that supposed to represent? Even at the same time, it's like, well, yeah, she did fight for her country. She was in the Union Army. She was working as a spy. So yes, CIA can claim her, as a spy. But what does that mean? Because basically the CIA that has been in opposition to Black liberation here and abroad just makes you wonder what's going on here, because obviously CIA and Black Panthers and Black liberation groups will claim Harriet Tubman as a foremother. So it's interesting that her very symbolism has come to mean all of these different things just based on the amazing work that she did during her lifetime. And then also, I want to bring it back to what does it mean to safeguard a Black feminist legacy? Because I do believe, in terms of the criticisms that we receive from those particular Black feminists who's like, this is commodifying Harriet Tubman. We don't need her on the $20 bill. They certainly would not, celebrate the CIA erecting her statue at their headquarters either. But I think one of the things that's interesting about how we deal with Harriet Tubman's legacy, when I say safeguarding a Black feminist legacy, what I mean by that is she, in so many ways, I think Black women see Harriet Tubman as a mother, as an aunt, as a grandmother, and so therefore she becomes ours. And so there's a way in which you want to safeguard the ancestor. And many people have called her ancestral mother, even though some of the descendants are like, find your own ancestor, she's mine. So it's like, okay, they didn't mean that literally, but spiritually, she's an ancestor. These are some images that I thought really highlights what I think of as Harriet Tubman's sisterhood. Right, because this is the image on the left is a class photo of those who attended the founding convention of the National Association of Colored Women in Washington, D.C. I love this photo. I actually blew it up and have it hanging in my office because it just reminds me of the kind of collective movement that is required of Black women coming together. And by the way, I'll just point her out for those of you wondering where she is. That's her in the little black bonnet. If you look closely, you might be able to find Ida B. Wells in there and Mary Church Durrell. I mean, they're all there in this class photo. But Harriet Tubman is there. They gathered around the time that Black women were trying to defend themselves. They gathered in the wake of the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that legalized Jim Crow racial segregation. So they are there trying to move us forward as a community. And Harriet Tubman in particular was there She was singing to the crowd. She was sharing her stories about the work she did in the Civil War. She even held up the firstborn baby of Ida B. Wells, and showed him off to the audience. I mean, so that is the community in which she was working and doing, her Black feminist work. Also, the image on the right, I think, is significant to this legacy as well. This is her funeral. And if you can look closely, you can actually see her body, the body lying in state. And this is in the AME Zion Church in Auburn, New York, March 11th, 1913. Remember, she died March 10th. And I love this photo as well because she's surrounded by these women who were handpicked by Harriet Tubman to serve on her board for the Harriet Tubman home. So before she died, she made sure that her home was in good hands. And I think she was very deliberate in picking women in particular to oversee that work. So these are the women, I call them surrounding her like sentinels. So we got the sisterhood around her, and just behind them, you see the US flag that will be draped on her casket to honor the fact that she was a veteran. And so we always have the push and pull between, Black feminist resistance as well as this kind of national belonging that they are asserting for Harriet Tubman. And that also, I think, is part of the legacy of Black feminist reclamations of Harriet Tubman. These three images I just wanted to share before, coming to the end of my presentation. The image on the left, the top left, are members of the New York Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. They funded a headstone for Harriet Tubman's gravesite in Auburn, New York, and they were able to place that headstone 2 years after she died in 1915. And then the image on the right is from 1944. It's a World War II image of the National Council of Negro Women who had raised bought war bonds to be able to launch this Liberty ship warship called the SS Harriet Tubman. And I actually believe the woman in the light colored suit is Mary Church Terrell. I need to verify that though. But then you also have, from 1974 and 1980, the Combahee River Collective, and they were a Black lesbian feminist group that named themselves after Harriet Tubman's campaign on the Combahee River because of what her ability to free so many people meant for them. They were organizing around how do we free ourselves as Black women, as Black feminists, right? And so in these three moments in the 20th century, Harriet Tubman, we have always done this work either of remembrance, making sure we remember her, national recognition. The Liberty ship SS Harriet Tubman is about national recognition. And then, of course, Combahee River Collective is trying to assert the Black feminist resistance of what her legacy means. And we also see that in contemporary moments. So in this particular era, we have, for example, Girl Trek is a national movement. They've actually been retracing Harriet Tubman's 100-mile walk along the Underground Railroad, and they're doing it as a response to the health crisis and obesity and wanting to get Black women in shape. And similar to that, is a group called the Harriet's Apothecary based in Brooklyn, New York. And they were inspired by a dream of Harriet Tubman, where they are creating these healing villages. So they're doing this work around health and wellness for our communities, and they're doing it through the spirit of Harriet Tubman. So finally, I'm just going to read aloud. This is like the concluding section of that same introductory essay to the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project. Her freedom is our freedom. Born in either late February or early March in 1822, Tubman is the bridge between Black History and Women's History Months. She stood at the intersection of race and gender and ushered in freedom for all because her own freedom required it. As the Combahee River Collective, named for Tubman's leadership, assert in their Black feminist statement from 1977, quote, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression," unquote. Tubman understood this, which is why a week before her death, she had delivered a message to Black suffragist Mary B. Talbert during the National Women's Suffrage March on March 3rd, 1913, quote, "Tell the women to stand together, for God will not forsake us," unquote. Unfortunately, many white suffragists chose racism and exclusion over unity. The radical Black feminists like Ida B. Wells Barnett defied such divisiveness by asserting their rightful place in the fight for voting rights, gender equality, and racial justice. These same Black women fought to keep alive Tubman's memory, from purchasing her headstone to resurrecting her name for civil rights and feminist movements, just as they fought to ensure this nation made democratic ideals a reality for all. And that, I think, is Harriet Tubman's legacy, making democracy a reality for all. So this final image that we have here, this is the full image of Nichise Gaskin's Beacon of Hope. I wanted to end with that because I do take a lot of inspiration, the star patterns, the newly discovered photograph. It reminds me that Harriet Tubman is a compass, both natural and moral, and we can really use her as like this guiding light as we're trying to move forward in our contemporary moment. So thank you for tuning into this presentation. And this is my contact information. And this is also a link to the Tubman 200, the Bicentennial Project. It's up there, it's free and accessible. So I encourage you to check it out. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hobson. Let's give her a round of applause. I know you can't hear, but I was told there are like 1,300 people who registered for this, which is amazing testament to who Harriet Tubman is and to what you are in terms of your work. I was really touched by the images because many of them I have not seen. Or in the same format that you presented them. I've seen some of them, but the explanations you gave, for example, I saw that one of the women surrounding her, the sentinels you call them, at the Tubman house in Auburn, and I never knew who they were, but I probably didn't stay to read it completely if they were there. But what I love is that you took us through not just Harriet Tubman, but it's like a whole history of Black feminist organizing, which we see through her person. That's all. So I'm really, really pleased with that. And I thank you so much for this work. My students, I think, are going to be so knowledgeable, even more so now. We have some great questions, and please make sure you have some more if you feel free. And maybe I can combine them. One question was, why did she choose Philadelphia? And I think you answered that briefly, but Janell, let me know if you want to take more than one or how we should go with it. Okay. And then somebody also asked, this was from Ivory Allison. Thank you, Ivory Allison, for that question. And then Mark asks, are there any audio recordings of her? Which is really fascinating. And then there's a great question, did she ever travel outside the US, Canada, which is fascinating. And I'm really pleased because Ronald Cummings has a nice chapter where he talks about Harriet living in Canada at one point, right?
Yes.
So maybe those three, and then we'll take some more.
Okay, sure. So I think with the going to Philadelphia, that had a lot to do with the kind of networks that she had learned about. And that was one that she was directed towards. Because as I said, by the time she gets to Philadelphia, she's given an actual station to go to, and that is William Still, who was living in Philadelphia and working on the Underground Railroad at the time. So what were the other two?
One was, are there any audio recordings of her?
Okay. No, I do not know that. I would love to discover that.
I know, me too.
So maybe there is, we don't know, not yet. It's very possible because so many people were interviewing her. Granted, I need to think about when audio recordings were available because she did die in 1913. So
exactly.
So I don't know that was widespread at the time, but that doesn't mean that it's completely impossible. So
Right. And then the other one, did she ever travel outside the US and slash Canada? Because she did
oh,
live in Canada for a while.
yeah, and that's another thing. I don't know if she did. From what I gather, it seems that she did not. But I like to leave that question open because we're still doing research and learning stuff about people, so you never know what's going to show up.
Exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah,
make the same claim with Claudia Jones. I always think there's always more material there somewhere.
yeah,
And people find
absolutely.
them, right? So
Yeah.
there's a question from Chandra Pointer Titus. Is
Mhm.
there truth to a daughter born to Harriet but hidden and cared for by a free Black family?
Oh, okay. So that is an interesting question. Right now, there's only speculation about it. We know that there was a niece, one that she claims is a niece, Margaret Stewart, I believe is her name, and she actually was living with the Stewarts in Auburn, New York at the time. So because of her closeness to this niece, who was like a favorite niece, people have speculated that she may have been more than a niece. I think some of that is wanting to think that Harriet Tubman had a biological child. Right now, on record, she did not have her own biological children. She adopted a daughter later on in freedom. And then the records of that daughter kind of went missing. So we don't know much about that daughter either. But there is this idea that the Margaret Stewart might have been an actual daughter. And some interesting stuff about the descendants of Harriet Tubman, because on that side of the family, the descendants are not very eager to take DNA tests, to settle the question, which is interesting. They seem more comfortable being a niece rather than being descendant of a niece rather than being descendant of a daughter. And so much of that has to do with respectability politics. If Marjorie Stewart was a daughter, she would have been born after she and John Tubman had separated. So,
Okay. Right. So it would have been another
yeah,
entity.
yeah,
I don't know if she would have, she didn't strike me as somebody who would hide having a daughter. She'd probably be very proud, which
yeah.
is very interesting.
Yeah. So that's the other thing too, because I wasn't sure she was somebody who would just hide. That
Exactly. She
did
spent
have
a
a
lot of time doing
yeah,
things that.
yeah.
Anyway, we have some really cool questions. This one you are going to love. You touched on it, but
Mhm.
this is it from Amy J. How should we think about commemorative movements such as the Women Under 20 campaign in the context of Black feminism? Is
Mhm.
it disrespectful to venerate Tubman on currency when we're still dealing with material wealth disparities in a system that still exploits Black women?
Yeah, and that is the ongoing debate. From in my own opinion on that subject, I still think that having her on our currency, um, you know, makes her visible. I think her visibility is important. And not only do I think the visibility is important, but if every time we take out our $20 bill and we see Harriet Tubman and we're like,
Exactly.
we could exploit it economically, then maybe it will actually spur us to think about how we're spending our $20. So
Yeah, in the Caribbean, for example, nanny is on Jamaican money. So
yeah,
I think it's a question so locked into American
yeah,
racism and race relations
yeah,
that
absolutely.
we lose sometimes. The places where we have major representation that
Mhm.
could get further represented. But
Oh,
I do understand the concern.
I hear the concern, but that
Yeah,
is really where I come from. And it is an honor. We don't have those questions about, nobody is worrying about Andrew Jackson
I
being
know.
crucified.
Take him
That's
off.
for real. But we want him removed
I
because
know. But more
we
than likely, I think we want to hold on to those
yeah,
$20. If we had them, we'd be saving them. And so
that's what I'm
we try to
thinking.
collect only those like that.
Well,
Hip hop.
someone on Black Twitter has this needs to be a thing because I could see every time I pull out a $20, she's going to be like, you don't need that.
I know. I know. Okay, from Charlene Mitchell, which is an amazing name actually, and the original Charlene Mitchell
Oh,
is from
okay.
Brooklyn, but I don't think she's with us. Is it true Harriet suffered from narcolepsy? I believe you addressed it,
Yes. So
but
it's
yeah,
not narcolepsy, it was temporal lobe epilepsy. That's what historians
okay, a
say.
little bit different.
That's a little bit different.
Mm,
Narcolepsy is just lapsing into like deep sleep or whatever. And sometimes
exactly.
she would freeze up and things like that. But there were all of these other conditions that she suffered from that suggest that it was temporal lobe epilepsy.
Now we have, according to our host, we had 340 viewers. So
Oh,
y'all, there's still more time. There's still more time for questions.
okay.
So, what is Dr. Hobson? And this is an interestingly provocative question, and necessarily so from Amy. What does Dr. Hobson make of the critical race theory debate about teaching Black American history in public schools across the U.S.? Is
Mhm.
Dr. Hobson concerned about mainstream watering down of Harriet Tubman's story and legacy? And I could see why, because in Florida, I believe the governor, there was a proposal from a press
Mhm.
to just say Rosa Parks just moved, but
Mhm.
to another seat. They wanted her to move to another seat, as
Right.
opposed to why
Mhm.
she refused to move. Period.
Yeah.
So yeah, in other words, like the person was just asking her to move to another seat. So
Mm.
anyway, so what do you think of the watering down what she means? Is it possible
Mhm.
in the way she's presented?
Yeah. What's interesting about the critical race theory debates is I really believe, if you followed my timeline, that it's precisely because we've been pushing for a Tubman 20 that has,
Okay.
don't forget the first gesture of that certain president was about pushing back against that. And it's that same president who also got started on the vilification of critical race theory. So
Right.
these things are connected. And
And that gets lost, isn't it, in the debate
yes,
that had happened
yeah.
earlier. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are all connected. What I will say, because we can't, wherever you are, I don't think it's just move to another state, just vote for better people, seriously,
I know.
and fight for your voting rights so that you can vote for, better people. We need to safeguard our histories. I think that we can't get caught up in, oh, it's against the law to teach, Harriet
Yeah.
Tubman.
Mm,
If they actually pass a law against teaching Harriet Tubman, then guess what? You go and you do a read-in.
thank you.
You go and actually you open up all your biographies, you go and do a mural of Harriet Tubman, you put her in their faces. That's what you do. you know
Exactly.
you,
You
you don't
can,
back down. You just don't back down.
if you
And
follow her lead, you won't, where
well,
she says keep
exactly. If you
going.
follow her lead, you won't. You do keep going. That's something that you learn. So we can't be afraid of these battles because they are designed to whip up fear. And specifically, what we're hearing, like I said, it was deliberate in terms of the pushback. It was deliberate in terms of the backlash for those of us who are trying to move forward. Whether we're talking about a Black president, Black first lady, Harriet Tubman on the 20, or what have you, there will be people who will be resistant to that because what's going on is we have certain people who really feel that they are losing their power,
Mhm.
whether we're talking about white people, whether we're talking about men, whether we're talking
Exactly.
about straight people and the rise of LGBTQ and cisgender folks afraid of transgender. I mean, lots of people are being challenged to think about our different identities, and so either we are about wanting to create an actual multicultural, diverse United States of America, or we want to go back to something that's all white and all male. We have to make a choice. When I said Harriet Tubman is at the crossroads, that's what I mean. We are at a crossroads, so we do have to make those decisions. But we cannot forget our history because Harriet Tubman was walking 100 miles to freedom in the dark to get to
Mhm.
freedom, and she went back 13 different times to free other people. And in the civil rights, Rosa Parks sat down on purpose, not because she was tired, but because it was a strategy People were doing that work. People were doing sit-ins, they were doing freedom rides, and we're going to have to strategize about what to do. But for the most part, what I think is going on with the whole critical race theory is it's designed to whip up a certain kind of fear. It's designed to whip up this idea that that certain people are taking over. Actually, let's just cut to the chase. Black people are taking over, because when you really get down to it, when folks are saying woke and they're saying critical race theory, they just mean Black people.
Exactly.
That's what they mean. And so we need to think about what is that anti-Black racism tied to, and how do we challenge it when we hear it, and to be aware that that's what it is, and to not back down. And if you appreciate lectures like mine and professors like, Carol Boyce Davies, we're here still teaching, still able to, hopefully, in New York State, but hopefully we can also support others in other states where people are trying to do a crackdown. Because when you are trying to create fascism, the very first people you attack are the artists and the academics. And that's right. What's going on. So we have to.
That's what's going on, and banning books and so on.
Absolutely.
So great question from Judy. Did she and Sojourner Truth know each other?
Yes, absolutely.
Great.
They knew each other, and they are two different people. It's always amazing how people keep confusing them. Sojourner Truth is like 6 feet tall, and Harriet Tubman is 5 feet, so they don't even look the same. But they did know each other. They actually met in 1864 in Boston, around the time that Sojourner Truth was actually going around the country promoting Abraham Lincoln's re-election. And even though they met, they kind of had a disagreement about President Lincoln. Harriet Tubman was kind of impatient with him, but Sojourner Truth did have a chance to meet with him, and she felt that he was an honest person, and that he was true, to actually trying to advance in terms of the Emancipation Proclamation and everything. But it's a useful thing to think about how they could, have different ideas about the same people. I mean, eventually, I think Harriet Tubman came around to appreciating Lincoln, but Sojourner Truth was very much on board with that. But they did meet over, their differences, and so I think that's fascinating.
One of the fascinating points that came up in class once was that this contemporary group of students, often did not know about John Brown, and were like quite surprised that they were friends. Could you talk a little bit about that, perhaps? I know you touched on it in one of the timeline.
Yeah. I actually would love to do more research on that. I'd like to know more about their relationship, because I'm struck by the fact that of all the people she worked with, when it came time to dedicating her Harriet Tubman home, she chooses to name her infirmary after John Brown. And so it's like that suggests that was a kind of deeper friendship than we have been thinking about. And I think it says something about them being able to have a kind of allyship and friendship across race, across gender, that I don't think we really talk much about. And I think it would be great if we could, because most people like to, dismiss John Brown as like this radical, crazed person.
Exactly.
It's like, actually, he should be your anti-racist ally.
That's what I'm thinking.
Seriously, if stop comparing yourself, to the worst, white supremacists, and actually ask yourself, as a white ally, are you closer to John Brown or not? and start measuring yourself in terms of what does that look like, because he was doing that work. And someone else who's also connected to him, which I think is interesting, is another abolitionist named Mary Ellen Pleasant. And she was a Black woman who was able to attain wealth in California. And there's a whole rumor that she actually helped to finance his raid on Harper's Ferry and to actually deliver him the arms that he needed. Rumors, but I'm always fascinated by it. And the Jamaican author Michelle Cliff wrote a novel based on that particular history called Free Enterprise. I definitely recommend it.
So last word, since this is a class that was focused on Black women and political leadership. We deliberately chose Harriet because clearly she embodies all of those principles. So how would you, if you were teaching it, what would you, teaching her separately, what would you recommend to people who want to include her in teaching situations in class? In my case, I was always linking it to the way that the Black Feminist Combahee River Collective statement always used that. And of course, many people did not know what it meant until even more research was done about what she actually did, besides the back and forth to the Underground Railroad, actually liberating close to 800 people from slavery. So what would you say in this about those conjunctions?
That's an important part. I definitely think teaching about her leadership through the Combahee River is a great example. Actually, there's a new book coming out by Eddie Fields Bank called On the Combahee River. It's going to be one of the first history books to actually look at that community of folks who were freed on the Combahee.
Wow.
So that's exciting that that's coming out. And the author, she actually did contribute an essay to the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project about Harriet Tubman's work on the Combahee River. Obviously, I would teach the Bicentennial Project because of the rich collection of essays I was able to put together on that. I think Kate Larson's Bound for the Promised Land is still a good resource because it's so filled with so many useful details about her life. I think Paula Giddings, the work that she has done also in When and Where I Enter, her book does talk about Harriet Tubman in relationship to other Black feminists during her time period. So we have a number of people who have made those connections. So thinking about her and the networking that she did, I think is also really important. There's actually a new book also that came out this year. Douglas Armstrong, who's an archaeologist, and he has a book about the archaeology that he did at the Harriet Tubman home. He also contributed an essay about that.
Cool. We were really concerned too, and my students agreed with me, of course, that often when you see film on her, they always talk about that loss of that first husband who kind of abandoned her and quickly got another wife. Well, I mean, many women have experienced that same exact thing, but that she also had a happy relationship with somebody else later in her life. But that doesn't get into any of the films. I don't know if it's still that respectability piece you mentioned earlier, or what happened.
Well, I think what happens in a lot of films is that people spend so much time on the Underground Railroad that they forget to explore the rest. You know, and I know when I watched the movie that came out in 2019 by Casey Lemon's Harriet, I was like, oh, okay, we're getting a new movie. And then it was mostly about the Underground Railroad and just a little postscript piece about her work on the Combahee River. And the next thing you know, she's going home. It's like, wait a minute, where's that story?
So there's space for more film.
Oh, absolutely.
More readings and more study.
Yeah. And actually, Viola Davis was at one time connected to HBO. They were going to do a limited series about Harriet Tubman, but I think at the end that fell through and she's no longer connected to it. I don't know if HBO is still going to move forward with it or not, but
it may still happen in the future.
Maybe.
So we want to thank you so much for such a great way to spend an evening. Thank you, Janell Hobson, for your work, your continued
thank
work.
you for having me.
Thank you for gracing us with your presence and these amazing images and history and that journey through her life, through all those experiences. I love the linking it to stars. The other person is Neil Hurston, who actually said things like, if you jump for the sun, you'll get off the, you may not reach it, but you'll get off the ground. And NASA uses that in one of their images in the space headquarters here in Jupiter, in Florida. So fascinating that you linked it at the start to the stars, because that's pretty much what she did. And I imagine living in upstate New York, working at a place like Cornell, and I tell this to students all the time, that you're actually treading over ground that she would have passed, because the church downtown, the St. James AME Zion, she attended there. She spoke in that church, and there's a nice little note of that in the church itself. So we're in that sort of space, upstate New York, where a lot of things happen, a lot of bad things in
Yeah.
terms of dispossession of Indigenous people,
Yeah.
but a lot of struggle for Black people to reclaim themselves.
Absolutely. We have a similar church in Albany too, with the same history. So it's like Harriet Tubman's been here. She
Wow,
really
she's
has
been
been.
through here many different places. So we thank you for this work. And we thank our audience for staying and for your attendance. And stay tuned. We'll be doing more things. We want to really populate the airspace with knowledge that people can use and come back to, because many people register, but they will come back and look at the video as they can. I know some students have to work and said they were going to do it when they got off work. So we'll be having others following up and listening to your work. And we thank you so much. And thank you, Naomi Aaron Boateng, for your introduction. And thank you to the staff of eCornell, amazing staff for their work. And good evening, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.